Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Off-Farm Income Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us here on our YouTube channel. Well, you have tuned in for episode 727, I think. Don't hold me to that. But today we have a fascinating interview, a long interview. This one went a long time, but that is okay. It went long because there was so much great information. I'm going to be speaking with Mark Hufford, who's coming to us out of Indiana. He and his wife started and own Double M Farms, and they also write about farming on the Farmer's Pitchfork, their blog, and they've got a very unique model of farming, of the way they're raising their beef cattle and their pork and the way they're marketing that. At least this is one I haven't run into yet, and this is one I like a lot. They've also got a very unique way of creating off-farm income with oxen, and he will tell that part of the story as well. That comes way at the end of the interview, everybody. You may want to watch this one in two parts, but it is well worth it. This is great info. We're going to start it for you right now. Mark, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you. Yes, thanks for having me.
Hey, you bet. I really appreciate you reaching out to me. I love it when folks find me out there, and wherever the world they find me, on social media or podcasting or whatever, when they reach out and they say hi, I'm always so happy to get those emails and those messages. Really appreciate it.
Well, it was a joy to find out about you and what you're doing, the work you're doing.
Well, thanks very much. Well, so it turns out that what you're doing is something that is very interesting to me. Well, you're doing a couple different things, but the one thing that stood out when you reached out to me was the oxen. And I did a previous interview with a young man who was raising oxen in the Northeast, and I think you had heard that show, and you said, well, we're doing that as well, and that's our form of off-farm income. And that is fascinating to me because it's old world, and it's something that you just don't see that often any longer.
Yeah, you're right about that. It's something that was so commonplace up to about the turn of the century, around 1900. It was just the commonplace power source, you might say, in American history. And it's so interesting to me how it's, since progression has moved on, things have moved on in progression in agriculture that, to my knowledge, our yoke of oxen and one of those yoke of oxen are the only two in the state of Indiana. So
Okay.
Very few.
Yeah, that is not much at all. Wow, that's interesting. So we're going to get into that as we go through our interview today, and we're gonna talk more about your story and about what you and your wife are doing with your farm, with Double M Farms in Indiana. Let's do this. You've got an interesting story. We were just talking off the air, and it turns out that your wife and I grew up very close to each other. We probably even bumped paths at some point, so we'll get into all of that. But tell us your story. Kind of tell us how you've traveled around the country and how you've wound up back in Indiana.
Yeah, I grew up on a farm here in central Indiana. My mom and dad farmed. My grandparents farmed. I'm a fifth-generation farmer, and mostly here in Indiana. My grandparents did live tried it in North Dakota back before the turn of the century, right after the turn of the century, early 1900s.
Okay.
Failed at that, moved back to Indiana. But so just love farming. Grew up, falling asleep in the cab of a tractor with my dad working ground or harvesting. I have many memories of sitting in the cab of the combine with my grandpa shelling corn. Mm-hmm. And so it was just, etched on my heart to love agriculture. And my wife, grew up there in Modesto, California, that area, mm-hmm. and her family were farmers. We met each other and got married in 1996, and was married a couple years. We farmed here, and things weren't going well in the late 90s in agriculture. Things were really hard, and we were struggling to make ends meet, and just seeing that things weren't going the direction we wanted them to go with agriculture. We had much too close a relationship with our banker than we preferred, so we just decided, you know what, this isn't the direction we want to go, and so we sold out and moved to Oregon in 2000.
Okay.
And we had a friend out there. We had some connections out there in the Willamette Valley, and we went out there and absolutely fell in love with the area. Love the Willamette Valley. Just the diverse agriculture is just amazing.
Yeah.
But we couldn't keep our feet really out of agriculture. We worked for a paving stone manufacturing company the first 2 or 3 years. Kind of got our feet wet there in the Willamette Valley, and then bought some cattle and started a pasture management company, actually.
Okay.
And turf management. We also managed turf, so we kind of had two sides. So we was involved in agriculture from that perspective. We did everything from fertility to pest management, weed control, new seedings, new pasture establishment renovation. Grew that company, and that went well for us, and it kept us involved in working dirt, you might say, and we had some cattle for our own family and raised some sheep, and always had a few pigs, you might say.
Yeah.
And so let's see, I think it was around 2009, found out an event over in Idaho, Salmon Falls, Idaho, called Lost Rivers Grazing Academy. And went over there, and Jim Garish was one of the keynote speakers, and we just kind of learned agriculture, pasture management from a whole new paradigm. Before, when we were farmers in Indiana, and we just kind of did what every farmer did, you might say. And so that was kind of the groundbreaking or birthing, you might say, of just the way we thought about agriculture, the way we managed agriculture, the way we approached agriculture. And those 4 days were monumental. We loved the area, and the training was excellent, put on by the University of Idaho. And came home and just kind of re-looked at even the way we did our pasture management company. Ended up selling that company and moving back to Indiana in 2010. And I told my wife, I said, you know what, I want to get back into agriculture, or we wanted to get back into farming. The family farm once we had moved, my dad had said, hey, we're not going to do this anymore since you're moving off. And so we had given up all of our ground and sold equipment. And so we was starting over really at ground zero.
Okay.
And that was probably the best place to start out, the hardest place, but probably the best place. Because we decided, we're going to try to do this debt-free. We're going to try to do it slow and see if we can build something worthwhile for our children. And so that's what we did. We've been at it just going on 10 years, and it's fun now to start seeing rewards from the hard work and finally see things start coming together in a positive way. But it's been tough, but it's awesome to see now our children are involved in the farm and will now be the sixth generation on the Hufford side to continue into agriculture.
That's great. So when you say that you gave up the land, or your family gave up the land, they leased it out, but kept ownership of it? Okay. So you were able go ahead. Right,
yes. And they did, and even land that was owned was sold. My dad had a back in the 80s when hogs really got bad, agriculture got bad, he had started a construction and roofing company to make ends meet, and stayed in farming. And so there was some changes made in the farm then, just to kind of focus things and position things where he could be in something that was working well financially for the family, as well as stay in farming. And so, things had been liquidated. Land had even been sold. Some land had went, other tenant farmers, things like that. So we basically, when we moved back in 2010, there was land available in the farm, but it was tied up with other tenant renters or other family members. We've got cousins, uncles that still farm, and that land was tied up. So we had to start off at ground zero.
Got it. Okay. Really interesting. Now, you mentioned that you had a pasture management business. Tell us what that is. How does a pasture management business work?
Well, basically, we would come in and take a look at a pasture that was struggling, a lot of times overgrazed, was probably the number one thing that made our phone ring, you might say. And we would come on board and start consulting with the landowner Generally, it was the equestrian industry that we worked with.
Okay.
Not always. There was a few cattle owners, but generally the cattle owners were probably overall better managers of their pastures, you might say, already. So we would just come in and, take a soil sample and start the process of rejuvenating that tired pasture. Sometimes it required plowing it under, you might say, working it under, and totally starting over. Other times we would just overseed it and work on it from a fertility standpoint and get it back productive, then help the property owners, the barn managers, to manage their pasture with some rotational grazing, trying to help them not to overgraze, things like that.
Gotcha. So folks would pay you for the consultation service, but also for the service of coming in and either overseeding or just starting over completely?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And so when you say, I just want to park on this just for a second. So when you say that the bulk of your customers were in the horse industry, is that based on return on the dollar? And I guess what I'm getting at is when you've got somebody raising cattle, they're looking at how much am I putting in, how much am I getting out, because they're selling those calves every year maybe, or however they're marketing their cattle. But with horses, they're either keeping them for pleasure or it's a longer-term game where they're selling them after they're trained or something like that. Is that the kind of the difference between those two sets of customers for you in that business?
Yeah, I would definitely say that. Yeah, the cattlemen, most of them were multi-generational farmers, generally speaking, and they understood grazing management. They had a pretty basic, they had a knowledge of that. And plus, their margins were a lot tighter, and I knew that, what I'm saying, just like you're saying. Where the equestrian industry, a lot of times it was something that was recreational. It was something, a lot of times, it was hunter-jumper. A lot of our customers were equestrian, English, in the English class of riding, things like that. And they had that extra income to go ahead and put the energy and the time and the money into managing and improving their pastures. Okay. The biggest thing I found out, it was just a lack of knowledge. They didn't know how to do it. They didn't know what it took. And sometimes they didn't even really care. They just said, hey, I'll pay you. You come in and help us manage our pastures and keep, the grass growing.
Gotcha. Interesting. Okay. So you had gone out to Oregon. Where in the Willamette Valley were you at?
Just out of Salem, in the Salem-McMinnville area.
Okay. Yeah, it is such a different, you get into that valley and ag looks totally different than I'm used to, whether it be growing up in the Central Valley of California or now over in southwest Idaho. You get into there, and it's just a totally different deal.
Yeah, you're right. Yes. It's such a diverse agriculture, and even really kind of the soil types vary there in the Willamette Valley. Just beautiful. We would do work on the west side of the valley, and we had to deal with that a little bit different than on the east side or Central Valley. But overall, the weather cycles were pretty much the same across the valley. And, we would a lot of times get a window in February where we could, seed new or do a renovation and do seed work in February. Yeah. And by, June, they would have a decent pasture stand coming up. Or we would do our fall seeding and get the rains through the wintertime and get something up and going. But yeah, very diverse agriculture, that's for sure.
Very cool. Now, living in Idaho, I'm well aware, Jim Garish, well aware of the Lost Rivers Grazing Academy and the areas that you're talking about. How did you find out about that, and how did you wind up coming over here to attend that?
Well, I can't really remember how I found out about it. I think it was probably in Stockman Grass Farmer paper. Okay. I used to get that. I don't get that anymore, but I used to get that. And if I remember right, there was an ad in there, a write-up about the Lost River Grazing Academy. And I didn't know anything about management-intensive grazing. I didn't know anything about, calving later in the spring, just a lot of things that we learned there at the Lost Rivers Grazing Academy. I didn't even know who Jim Garish was. I knew he wrote there in the Stockman Grass Farmer. But it was so rewarding. It is just an excellent program they put on there.
Yeah, I've definitely heard the same thing, and And I've not gone to the academy or met Mr. Garish, but I've the next person down, the train the trainer type of thing. I've received instruction from people and read a lot of stuff, and it's very, very interesting pasture management stuff.
It's very life applicable. One thing they would do is the first half of the day, you was in the classroom, and you was learning the the principles, learning how this all worked, on paper. But then after lunch, we would go out and we would each be broke up into groups, and in our group, each group would be given like a 5 or 10 acre ranch to manage with so many head of cattle.
Okay.
And so over those 4 days, we learned what to look for, and we'd spend the whole afternoon out walking our little ranch, looking at cow pies and seeing how much fiber was in the cow pies and how to look at cattle diets based on that. Just very life applicable teaching.
Yeah, very cool. Okay. So you and your wife, you head back to Indiana. You're starting basically from scratch. So you came up with a different model of farming when you went back than what you had when you left. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. In our area where we live at, Matt, in Carroll County, it's the largest pork-producing county in the state of Indiana.
Okay.
And I grew up on a hog farm. My father-in-law and my in-laws raised hogs until a few years ago. They finally sold out of the hog industry. But so hogs is, a large part of our area. I didn't really have interest in hogs. I had interest in cattle. But there's very few cattle in Carroll County, and there's very, very few pastures in Carroll County.
Okay.
Corn hit $7 here a few years back.
Yep.
And what pastures were around got plowed under to be put into corn. And so where we lived at had close to 30 acres, and it was mainly pasture land with woods, and that's where we started out with our home base. And then we just started, looking around for little patches that the big farmers didn't want to mess with.
Okay.
And that was kind of the beginning. And we went out and, we had to do some improvement on some of the land to make it even worthwhile. A lot of it didn't have fence, and so we had to deal with that. But yeah, just kind of built out small, and but have been able to increase our pasture land and some ground that we actually can to work as far as we don't do any row crop. That's one thing. We did do some row crop when we first started out, but that is just, the way I look at that, Matt, is the row crop industry that's one of the downfalls, I personally think, of agriculture, because we have cousins and uncles that are still row crop farmers, and we get together and they're always talking about the market. Yeah. And it's all determined by the Chicago Board of Trades or the markets, you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
And I understand that. I mean, that's what my dad dealt with. That's what my father-in-law dealt with. And I just said, there has to be a better way. I was a business owner. My dad had this roofing and construction company, and I realized there is a way you can set the price. You can determine that, but you're not going to be able to do it conventionally. And I have no criticism. I do not criticize my family or friends that are conventional farmers that are doing it, conventionally, you might say.
Sure.
I feel for them because I feel their pain, and I know they're dealing with that. But for Monica and I, we were just like, if we're going to do this debt-free, if we're going to do it differently, if we're going to try to make this be a ran like a business that needs to show a profit to sustain itself, we're going to have to approach it differently.
Yeah.
So we did a little bit of row crop, and finally decided, that isn't working out for us, which we're pretty confident wasn't going to anyhow. So we decided, we're going to focus on grass-fed beef and pasture-raised pork. And so we had been trying to develop that market. We had done some farmers markets. My wife and I had, when we first moved back in the West Lafayette area near Purdue University.
Okay. And
that went pretty good for us, but we had a baby, and the responsibilities of the farm kept me from going to the farmer's market, and my wife, now with a new baby, said, honey, I can't hardly do this. So we thought, well, we will just sell halves and wholes of beef and pork, and that didn't go real well for us. We found out that a lot of families, we thought, we would buy in halves and quarters and wholes, but a lot of families didn't want to do that. They just wanted to buy pieces. And so that didn't work real well for us. And so a couple years we kind of struggled with making that work. And eventually we started contacting farmers that were doing farmers markets, and they weren't raising beef or pork or poultry. They were doing the vegetables,
Okay.
but they weren't doing the meat products.
Okay.
And we started building relationships with them. And that's really when doors started opening up, you might say.
Interesting. So you wound up being a supplier for those folks who were doing the marketing for you there at the farmers market. Is that right?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
That's a great model. Interesting. Okay. So I want to touch back on something. That's a great piece of your story, and we want to dive deeper into that. I just got to say something about the conventional farming or the commodity-based farming. And so, because I feel the same way as you, except with a little bit of a twist on it. I would love to be big enough that I could be a commodity farmer. And for me, it wouldn't be in row crops. It would be in cattle. But if I had just a straight cow-calf operation where I was selling calves on the open market every fall, I would love to be that guy. But I'm not that guy, and so I'm like you. I have to find a niche, a way to make my farm profitable, because for me, that's important. I want the farm to be profitable. But with that said, and everybody's got a different way of thinking. When I look at things, when I look at problems, and I look at the way our world works or things like that, I always think about this. Right now, guys like you and me, that we get to sell grass-fed, grass-finished, we get to sell into these niche markets, and we get to command a price that helps us to be profitable. I feel like we're very lucky right now. Certainly, we're living in one of the most affluent times in the history of the entire world. I think that makes a big difference for us to be able to sell our food that way. I kind of look at it like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like we're a little higher up on the pyramid with our grass-fed, grass-finished beef. But if things ever got bad, like if we had a World War II situation again or something like that, we would boil down to the basics and then commodity. We need those commodity farmers to be able to produce food at those levels. And so to me, I kind of look at it in that linear fashion. And right now we're just fortunate enough to be able to survive out here on this end of the deal. But I don't know. Do you see it the same way, or do you see this as something that is always going to be there for us?
No, I agree completely with you, Matt. I do completely. I tell, we've had conversations with cousins and uncles and aunts. They're raising thousands of head of hogs, and I could never meet the demands that Tyson and IPC is asking for. And I have no desire to do that. And so, I totally agree with that. That there's going to be that need, and yes, if our economy would tank, I definitely think guys like you and I are going to feel it on the chin for sure.
Yeah.
I just feel bad because I just know my family struggles.
Yeah.
And they're good people. They're hardworking families, and they love agriculture. They love commodity-based farming, and I do too. I mean, there's things about commodity-based farming that's a lot less or a lot more appealing than what I do. You know what I'm saying? But I also know they got to be married to the banker. Yeah. And I'm talking multi-generational farms, and I just have a problem with that.
Sure.
We had a banker, that when things got hard on us, they really started cranking down the screws, and it just makes me a little bit, I just feel sorry for the farmers that are dealing with that, and I know I understand what it is to get the projections to the bank. I understand what it is to try to make the numbers work and how you work hard, you slave, you do what it takes, and you stress for the next hog check to come in.
Yeah.
So you can pay a few bills. You know what I'm saying? And so from that perspective, it's I feel for them guys. I really do. So, and it may not work for my children to continue this if the economy of a tank, just like you said.
Yeah.
It may not, but yet I think we're positioned to where if the economy would tank, we don't have debt over our head.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have, equipment loans. We don't have that kind of stuff to where we can ride that dip a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? We've ventured out to other revenue sources.
Yep.
We're diversified, and I think that's going to help in our situation at least.
Yeah, and I get it. I look at outside of agriculture. I look at my friends and my family who have jobs that they don't like,
Mm-hmm.
and they go to them every day, and
Mm-hmm.
and for some reason they continue to go to them every day versus going out and finding a way to spend their days and make their living in a way that is intrinsically rewarding to them. And then I sit in my studio on my farm and make podcasts, and I've turned this into a business somehow, and I get to be on my farm all the time, and I feel for them because I used to have a job that I didn't like, and I don't understand why they don't make the change. But I certainly understand the need to work, and I'm always just very thankful that we live in a time where, for some reason, I can put food on the table doing what I do. Because certainly, just not too long ago in history, this would not have been possible. So it's one of those things where I feel very fortunate. I don't understand why more people don't go out and chase their passion in that way, or find a better mousetrap. But on the other hand, I also know that enjoy this while we've got it.
Yes. Yep.
All right. Well, let's do this. Speaking of making a living, I have got to talk about a great sponsor really quick, Mark. I know you've got to have squeeze chutes, runways, and cattle panels and all of that on your farm if you're working cattle.
Oh, yes, that's a very vital, important part. Make things work right.
That's right. Well, I've got a great sponsor, everybody. I'm going to be talking about Powder River Livestock Handling Equipment. I hope you've gone over to their website recently, everyone. They've updated it, and now you can design your livestock handling system on their website. They've been putting out a lot of videos on Facebook for folks to see how things work and to talk about how they manufacture these things. And I've been there to their factory in Provo, Utah, and I've seen exactly how they build their panels and their squeeze chutes, sweep tubs, and everything else that you need to reduce the stress on your large livestock and to reduce the stress on the handlers when it comes time to work cattle or whatever it may be that you're doing. I hope you'll all go over to powderriver.com, check out everything they've got to offer, and then let your local farm and ranch retailer know you'd like to see that green Powder River equipment in their yard, so you've got the opportunity to buy that as well. It's powderriver.com, everybody. All right, Mark. Well, they've been a great sponsor for a long time now, and there's no sign of stopping. I always love to talk about Powder River. You probably saw their stuff when you were out here in the West at the very least.
I have, yes, and we do have their products here in the Midwest, and we have Powder River gates at our place.
Very cool. Well, that's great. Yeah, they make good stuff. Okay, so we've talked about your business. So now your primary business is tell us more about how you develop those relationships to where you are basically the supplier. So you're expanding the market offerings that folks have at the farmers market, but you don't have to be there yourself.
Yes, that's correct. What we did is we just approached some vegetable growers that was raising vegetables and were not really offering a beef, a pork product, and so said, hey, could we put this together? I have no desire to raise vegetables, but you do, and you've got this going, and you probably don't have any desire to have hogs tearing up your
Right.
property, so to speak, or raising cattle. There's a lot of capital investment in that type of stuff, and can we work together? And that's just kind of where it started, with a discussion, asking people, and then they had to talk to their market masters. Some markets will allow that, and some don't. But the ones that would, and some of them had some CSAs that they had established, and so that was another way they could have another value-added product to their CSA.
Okay.
And it just grew from there, you might say.
Okay. So let's talk numbers really quick, and I'll use my numbers. I'm happy to do that, but because I like the idea, and I especially like the idea if you've got so for example, I do a direct marketing business where I am selling those halves and quarters and wholes. And so if I've got cattle left over that are unsold, could I find somebody that I could provide them to, and we could share in the revenue. So right now, when I'm selling beef, I'm selling them for $3.75 per pound based on hanging weight. So for me, if I've got a steer that hangs, say at 600 pounds, that's about $2,200 in revenue for me off of that steer. So how does that compare? If I were to take a steer and instead of selling it that way, I was to go out and I was to find somebody who's selling at the farmer's market and saying, hey, I will supply you and help you sell this way. How do those numbers compare? Am I looking at a gain, at a loss, at a break even in terms of changing up how I'm marketing?
Well, for what works for us and the way we've set it up, it would be very comparable. The way we do it, Matt, is we sell to our farmers market customers, that is those who are marketing our product. We sell them our beef as a whole beef, or a half. They buy them as the wholes is what they do.
Okay.
And so we just sell them as a whole beef on the hoof. And so what they do then is they take them and have them processed and market those pieces, those beeves as pieces. And so really what that allows us to do is we're able to make the margin that we want to make, and then that allows them to make the margin they want to make by selling it by the piece.
Okay.
Yeah, and numbers-wise, we'd be very comparable with what you're selling for on per head. You know, we're at around there $2,200 a head or so, is kind of $2,000, $2,200. Kind of depends. We try to do our beef, you know, around 1,100 pounds or so. Is kind of where we try to finish them out. And so, yeah, we're right in there around $2 a pound live weight. We just sell them by the pound live weight. And so we need to work on our numbers a little bit for this coming year, but that's kind of where we're at. So it'd be very comparable.
Okay, interesting. And so what I was thinking when you first brought it up was you were providing them with the cuts of meat, and then you had some sort of a percentage you were taking off of that. But you're doing it a better way than I was thinking, because you don't have to mess with that at all. They're just buying the animal from you and then marketing it.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay.
We're raising it to the standards, obviously, they want, which for my customers, you know, it's grass-fed, no hormones, no antibiotics, that kind of stuff. And we market Red Devon, so we make a big deal about it's Red Devon beef. That's what we raise. And then they just take it, and their markets allow them to even, you know, our name is on the packaging, you know, as the producer. And what it does is we ran into, when we was doing the farmer's market, the challenge we ran into was you take and you process a beef, you process a hog, you have all the popular cuts, the pork chops, the T-bones, you know, but then what do you do with these cuts that aren't selling? You know what I'm saying? And so it just kind of eliminated all that. It makes it clean for us. We talked to my 21-year-old son is very involved in the farm, and it was just like, you know, the more we talked about it, it just makes it easier. Just say, hey, we're selling you a whole beef. You do with it what you want. And I have I've had meetings with my buyers, and they're making good money, and I'm glad they're making good money. I really am. You know, they're making good money on my pork, and I'm like, hey, you know what? We're making money. We're making the money we need to make. You're making the money you need to make. Let's keep moving forward. This is a win-win.
Now that's interesting on the pork. So I've played around with pork. We raise pigs. I direct market those to customers as well. But that's always such a challenge because I don't grow my own feed, so I got to go out and buy the feed for the pigs, and that creates a big challenge for me in trying to be profitable with those pigs. So when you're doing this, if you're willing to share, that's great. If not, I understand. But can you share your numbers on what you're selling pork for?
Yeah, so what we do is basically three different. We've been working this out, Matt, so bear with me a little bit. But we've sold conventional hogs, so hogs that are raised on conventional feed, okay? That would be GMO. It could be GMO feed.
Right.
We don't prefer that. Most of our hogs go as non-GMO hogs.
Okay.
So we did do several last year on organic feed, and that was kind of a new thing for us. But we had a customer that was wanting some organic hogs. We are not a certified organic farm, but his markets allowed us, as long as we could verify we was feeding organic feed, he could market that as organic pork.
Okay.
And so we tried both, okay? So basically, our hogs, we do have some sows and some breeding stock. We raise Berkshire hogs, and we do have some large black that we breed in, and the meat is phenomenal. We cannot keep pork. My market people cannot keep pork.
Okay.
I mean, I can't produce it fast enough. And so we don't raise our feed for hogs. When we was doing row crops, like I mentioned before, we was raising our own feed. And we was just stretched out too thin is what was happening. We was raising a non-GMO corn, non-GMO beans, and that required some more intensive management, that type of stuff. So what we do is we've got a couple different suppliers that will sell us non-GMO, certified non-GMO feed, and we go that route. So basically, we try to finish our hogs at 280 pounds.
Okay.
And our feed, I'm just going to use one of my suppliers. It's a higher price supplier versus my other one, but I've got these notes actually right in front of me, Matt. I didn't know we was going to talk about this, but so it's costing me 40 cents a pound. My feed is.
Okay.
And that's my high side. I have another supplier I can buy it from for about 33 cents a pound.
Okay.
Non-GMO. Organic's obviously going to be higher, but let's talk about non-GMO. So to feed out a hog to 280 pounds, it's a 3-to-1 conversion. So 3 pounds of feed for 1 pound of gain. So on these hogs, they're going to cost me, I'm going to feed approximately 840 pounds of feed.
Okay.
So at 40 cents a pound, they're costing me roughly $336 a hog.
Okay.
Okay. So at 280 pounds, here again, I'm selling my hogs on the live weight. I don't sell them on a hanging weight.
Okay.
And so we're right at 225 to 250, right in that ballpark, a pound live weight.
Okay.
So that puts us at right around 650 to 700.
Okay.
Roughly.
Wow. Okay.
And so basically, there you can take your $650, $700 number, take off your $336, and that's my direct cost on that hog.
That's fantastic. And then your customers, they're able to make up and still have a profit, even though they're paying $650, $700 for a pig. They're
making a significant profit. I'm not going to say the numbers give me.
That's fine.
But yeah, they're making a significant profit. Well, I can tell you one thing: they're selling their bacon for $15 a pound.
My goodness, wow.
And they can't keep bacon. So it's definitely the market. If I was going to do this in Carroll County, I'd go belly up. I couldn't do that. I was talking to a gentleman just the other day who was getting into Berkshire hogs. And he's a young guy, he worked in the factory, he wants to get back to farming, grandpa farm type of story.
Yep.
And I just told him, he lived up by Wabash, a rural agricultural community. He was just expressing some of his frustrations. He had taken some Burke hogs to the sale barn because he couldn't sell them. And he said, Mark, they brought $16 a head. Yeah, I understand.
Yep.
But I just told him, I said, you cannot make this business model work if you're not marketing it well to the populace that value what you're offering.
Interesting.
Now, if you want to be the farmer's market, if you want to go to the farmer's market or pay someone to do it, there's even more profit margin involved in this. But I don't want to do that.
Sure.
You know what I'm saying? I don't want that commitment. And my guys are already going because they're selling vegetables or they're selling flowers or other things. And so it's just an add-on product for them and another profit center for them.
Very interesting. Okay, so couple questions for you. When it comes, whether it's, well, you've already said you don't have enough pigs to supply the demand. And I don't know how it is on the beef side of things, but how does this work? Do your customers expect you to always have beef to provide them to keep up with the demand from their customers, or are there times where you go, sorry, I'm out?
Both.
Okay.
They want me to have product all the time.
Okay.
But they understand. I just try to communicate with them that that's impossible.
Okay.
I can't move that kind of. I'm not a farm to the size enough that I can have that kind of volume.
Okay.
And you run into where you're in a catch-20. You understand this, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
You got feeders, but you don't have a market. Nobody's wanting it right now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what do you do with them? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And when I first got started out, I went to my local vet to have some cattle work done on couple of my cows. I forget what it was. And he's a commodity-based veterinary, you might say. And what I was doing was kind of new for this area, and I think he thought I was kind of strange. He's a great guy. He was very amiable. But he just told me, he said, Mark, I think you're going to find out you're going to be able to raise the product easier than you are going to be able to sell it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true. I would totally agree with that. It's much easier to raise beef or raise pork and just raise the product up than it is to get it sold. And so what I would encourage any new farmer, anybody that wants to get into this, is you're going to have to work on both sides. You're going to have to work on getting the product raised, and then you're going to have to work on the other side, the retail side of it, however you decide to look at those retail markets, and you're going to have to communicate with those people. Mm-hmm. I know last winter we had 6 head of hogs at the end of the winter that I didn't have a market for. And I was like, what am I going to do with these pigs, you know? And so what I did is I started, communicating to my customer base and contacts. And one of my contacts notified me, talked to friends, some other folks that said, hey, that had never been my customer before, and they said, you know what, we'll take all 6 of them at my price. And so you definitely have to be a good marketer. You have to work on the marketing side of it. Look at multiple marketing avenues. This is one thing I've learned, Matt. I want to go back to my grandpa. Just tell you a quick story. My wife's grandmother was here for dinner Sunday, and she's 87 years old or so. They farmed all their life. Grandpa went home here a couple years ago, farmed all of his life, and as I was sitting there, we ate Thanksgiving dinner, and we were sitting there talking with Grandma. It was just her and I and my wife sitting at the table, and she was telling stories of their farming days. And Grandpa was always very conservative, a good farmer. He started farming literally at 10 years old. That's not an exaggeration. His dad left the family. He started farming at 14. I think she said he bought his first tractor, if I remember right. It was an Alice Chalmers. But anyhow, and fast forward, he was forward-thinking, and that's what I was telling my children last night at the dinner table as we was thinking about our family heritage a little bit. And I just said, Grandpa Skiles was forward-thinking, and here's how he was forward-thinking. He was very conservative with his resources, but he noticed he was losing a lot of baby pigs in the farrowing process at wintertime, and he thought there had to be a better way of doing this, but he didn't know what the solution was. And so Grandma was just telling us that he heard about a farmer over in Illinois, this would have been back in the 60s, that had put up a farrowing barn, a barn to farrow in. Mm-hmm. And so she said he made a trip and went over there and met the guy and came back and started talking about the idea of doing this. And she said people laughed him to scorn. They thought he was absolutely crazy. Won't work. Just the dumbest thing possible. He went ahead and broke the mold and put that barn up. And now you drive around Carroll County and there's thousands of hog barns. Right. And that's one thing I've thought about as I've worked with other people and working on a book that I'm writing right now. One of the mistakes that farmers make is they don't think outside of the box. You got to think outside of the box. And that's the hardest thing, especially for multi-generational farmers. It's hard to think outside the box. Sure. But if you're wanting to make this work, you got to think outside the box. And so for us, it with our mindset that we were going to try to do this, we was going to try to do it without debt, we was going to try to do it in a business form that worked. We just had to start. We started thinking outside the box, and then knocking on doors, trying things that we hadn't tried before. And Grandpa, it's interesting. We heard that story just this past Sunday, how he was kind of a role model. My grandpa on the other side of the family, back in the 70s, was he was very paramount involved in taking registered breeding stock down to South America in a program to take better stock to South America. And I remember I've seen pictures of the airplane they loaded those pigs on, and it was forward thinking. I mean, it was out of the box.
Yeah.
But my grandpa on the other side was doing that, and I think that's a paramount part of it.
Very interesting. So obviously it's in the genetics there. It's born into you to think outside. Well, I want to ask you a few more specifics because I like your model. I want to know more about it. And after all, it is my natural curiosity that kind of put me behind this mic. So your cattle and your pigs, vaccinations. Do your customers, do they care whether or not these animals are vaccinated in terms of how they're marketing to the end user there at the farmer's market?
I would say overall, generally, my higher-end customers do not want vaccinations.
Okay.
They want no hormones, no vaccinations. They want them a natural product.
Okay.
And so that means on my pork, I make it very clear that they're raised out on dirt in pasture, so to speak. And I tell them I do have a slab of concrete that in the wintertime, the pigs will go on the slab of concrete. Some of them do, just to minimize mud. But then we do have other customers that really don't care. I mean, and that's okay. You know what I'm saying? I understand both sides of the discussion, and so it's okay with me either way.
And then let me ask you about antibiotics. I mean, obviously they don't want them with antibiotics in the food. That's going by the wayside anyway. But what about therapeutic doses? You got a cow or a steer or whatever that comes down with pink eye or whatever. You need to treat it. What do you do with that particular animal? Do you have to pull it out of the program, or do your customers understand a therapeutic dose and they're fine with you leaving it in?
Well, to answer that question quickly, is they understand the therapeutic dose.
Okay.
Because I tell my customers that I will treat an animal. If it's sick, I'm going to treat it. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
But here's what we've learned, Matt, is genetics make a huge difference. I started off, I was not raised on a cattle farm. We went out there, Lost Grazing Academy. They had all black cows. They talked about Angus. We moved back here, and the beef price was at a sky-high record price. And we was wanting to get into cattle. And the more I looked at it, the more I understood it, which wasn't very much, I'll confess. I thought, well, I just need some cows, and we need something that'll do on grass. And I looked at my land and all this stuff, and we ended up with some Corrientes, which are a Spanish cattle. They're not a prized beef animal, let me put it that way.
Right.
They're more of a sporting animal. But that was largely based on my ignorance, but I learned a lot through those Corrientes. And one thing was you don't have to have calving problems. You don't have to have pink eye problems. You don't have to have a lot of worm problems. You don't have to have a lot of disease problems. And a lot of that is managed, which we really learned this at Lost Grazing Academy, but by genetics and the environment. And so when we was running strictly Corriente cattle, I was breeding to an Angus bull. We never one time pulled a calf. I never lost a calf, and I never pulled a calf one time. I haven't had pink eye on this farm in 10 years. Now, we've went to Devons. I haven't had pink eye problems with my Devons. I do have a Hereford Devon cross heifer on the farm right now that she struggled with it a little bit. I didn't have to treat her, but I was watching it pretty close this past summer. That's the first time. But still, never pulled a calf. Now, I did have a cow. It was a registered bull, actually, I bought down in Tennessee. It was a registered Red Devon bull I brought up here, and I did end up having to treat him with antibiotics. I ended up losing him. And so we do treat. If we've got a sick animal, we're gonna treat it, and I will let my customers know, hey, I will inform you if this animal that I'm going to sell you has anything. But generally, I pull them back. They either go to the sale barn, or we'll sell them to someone who doesn't care at a discounted price, which we've done that.
Okay. And let me ask you about your pigs as well. So are you farrowing your own pigs, or are you buying weaners?
We started out buying weaners.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, we're farrowing our own pigs.
Okay.
The gentleman we was buying weaners from, it was a great arrangement. He was an elderly guy, and it just worked out really well for us. But he got dementia, and he said, hey, I'm going to be getting out of this. So we bought some sows off of him, and that's how we got our start.
Okay. It's fascinating the way you're doing it. I really like it. And I find myself being very selfish in this interview because we're transitioning on my place a little bit where I've opened up some more ground we were growing hay on. I'm going to start grazing it, and I'm going to outsource my hay production. And so we're going to have more cattle, and I'm trying to figure out how to get those marketed if I can't find more customers to direct market to. But I like what you're doing. I really like the sound of that. I may try it myself.
Well, another thing to think about, Matt, is, find like-minded growers. That's another thing we've done. We've got connected up to some like-minded Devon growers that are raising cattle in the same fashion that we are.
Okay.
I've been on their farm. I know their management style. I know their feeding rotation. I know what they're doing. I trust them. They have integrity. They're raising the same kind of product that I'm raising. So let's say that I have a customer that has an immediate need and I don't have a beef.
Mm-hmm.
I call them and make the connection point. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
And so same way with getting rid of product. If you've got extra product, build those relationships that just like with those 6 pigs I had last winter, I was able to eventually get them sold, and I didn't take a loss on them or, have to try to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And that brings up another question too. Somebody needs a beef, you don't have one. How are you running a conventional calving season or like a tight calving season, or are you calving all over the place so you've kind of always got something coming ready?
That's what we're doing. Conventional cattle guys think I run too loose of a ship. I confess that. But I kind of look at it a little bit different. In nature, it isn't always managed. All your calves are coming in February. In fact, I looked at cattle, that you would calve in February, March, but Loss Raising Academy kind of challenged me with that to spring or summertime calving.
Yep.
So I kind of entered in with that paradigm. I love it. I love that. I have dropped a few calves. I lost a calf here that came in the wintertime here a few years back, and it was just too cold. And it's like, that was dumb.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and plus it spreads my market, my harvest out, which I like that. Same way with my hogs. I'm not always farrowing the batch at the same time. Now, if you was doing conventional agriculture, that's the way you'd want to do it. You'd have a whole batch you'd run through, and I understand why they do that. But for me, I'm needing to spread my hogs out, and so, my batches will consist of litters. Mm-hmm. We got 8 litter, one of 8, we got one of 12 or whatever, and I spread them out. And then I also try not to farrow in the dead of winter. That's another thing, because we do not have a farrowing barn. We farrow out on pasture, you might say, and so I try to minimize that as much as possible also.
Okay. Interesting stuff. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. I could go on and on about this, but I promised everybody to ask you about your oxen. So when you initially emailed me, you said that oxen were one of your forms of off-farm income. Can you explain to us what you're doing there?
Yeah. So this oxen thing, I just briefly will tell you, I did not have oxen on my radar at all, Matt. I mean, oxen was not even remotely in the corner of the recesses of my brain. I went to a living history event with my son, and these oxen were there. Uh-huh. And they're milking shorthorn, or Durhams is the historical breed name, but we would know them as milking shorthorn. Uh-huh. And they're massive. I mean, they're just absolutely huge. And there was an older gentleman there that had them, and I raised red Devons, and if you're very familiar with that breed, the first Devons came across with the Pilgrims in 1621, and George Washington raised Devons, and so they have some historical history to them also. Sure. And so I got to talking to the guy, and long story short, we befriended each other. He wanted to come see my Devons, and so he stopped by, and we just kind of befriended each other. And still had nothing on my brain about having oxen. He calls me in January, and he says, "Hey, I got to have back surgery." And my wife and I really think that we want your family to continue on with the oxen. And I looked at my wife after I hung up from the phone. I'm like, what is this all about? I mean, that's the truth.
Yeah.
And I didn't know anything about oxen. I didn't know. I thought oxen was a breed. I thought an ox was a breed. I didn't have a clue. And so we thought, well, first it was kind of a labor of love. We thought, well, Jim's got to have a surgery, and we can put him in with our cattle, and we'll see where it goes. Mm-hmm. And he had a few events, historical events, kind of prearranged that he had been doing. And he said, "Mark, you can do them if you want to. If you don't want to, you don't have to. Here's what they pay." Mm-hmm. And I said, "Okay, well, we're a very busy family. I'm involved with my dad's commercial business also, and farming and all this, and raising a family." And my family told me, they said, "Dad, if you decide to do this ox thing, you are on your own." And so I wasn't real sure. Well, anyhow, June come around, and the first event came up, and he had given them our name. They called, said, "Hey, you know what? It's close. It's only 15 minutes from here. Yeah, I'll go. I'll take the oxen." Mm-hmm. And during that, from January to June, I was watching YouTubes, and I was reading all things oxen, like the previous interview gentleman talked about, Drew Conway's book. I was learning what I could.
Yeah.
And so we went to that first event, and I was like, wow. I was just amazed at how much people were interested in oxen. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was a steady line. I just couldn't believe it. And so right after that event was another event, and I thought, well, I'll go to that one. And so I ended up going to that one, and same thing. I would call my wife from that event. It was in northern Indiana, 2.5 hours away. So I went up there, and they put me up to stay. It was a week-long event. And I would call my wife at night, and I would say, "Honey, you won't believe it." I was just mesmerized. I was like, I mean, the line of people to see these oxen, it just blew me away. Huh. It just blew me away. And so that really inspired me. It was like, people want to know about our history, and just the sheer size of these animals and the intelligence of them and what they do is just a natural door opener that I could never create, and it allows me to talk about agriculture, the history of agriculture, my Devons, my Berkshires, my farm, the history of farming, all those things I was passionate about. And even the ministry, I'm a pastor, so it allowed me to talk about, Jesus talking about yoking with oxen, as yoking with him, And so it was just an amazing thing. And so that was the first year we did about 4 events, and the word started getting out, and we started getting phone calls to more events. And so it has just really grown, and this 2020 looks like it's going to be an even bigger year for us to be out with the oxen.
So am I understanding right? Are you getting paid to take the oxen to these events?
That's correct, yes.
Very cool.
Yes. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, these events largely are living history, or they're agricultural history related. Uh-huh. Somewhere they're history related. Now we do some events that are just like family farm day. There's a farm in Lafayette. It's just kind of a historical farm, and they don't really have me come and represent history necessarily. They just know how much kids and people are attracted to them. Yeah. And so I just come to have an attraction, and it really is. It draws the crowd. It's amazing.
Really cool. That's a great way to do things. And, man, I love things that are working on multiple levels, and this sounds like it is. You're creating off-farm income. You're getting to talk about agriculture. You're educating people. You're keeping people in touch with history. It sounds like a great thing.
It is. And you know what? I enjoy it. I really do. It is something I really enjoy. It's a lot of fun. We have met so many neat people, so many families, so many neat people in these venues, and it's just a great opportunity to let kids, scratch the necks of these cattle and talk about, where milk comes from and where beef comes from. And we do an event, Southern Indiana. It's 3 days, and around 3,000 to 4,000 fourth and fifth graders come from their schools. And it just lets me talk about, history of ag. And not only that, the history of how agriculture has impacted America, as well as, our food and where our food comes from. And I take every opportunity I get. I'll tell you, I get asked about their horns all the time. Why does oxen have horns? So I'll use that as a springboard to talk about, all the products that come from horn. And I'll talk about why a lot of our cattle don't have horns today, and how about all breeds used to have horns, and why we eliminated horns, why we have polled cattle now, all those type of things. And the kids just soak it up. They're just like, wow, we didn't know all this. So it's a lot of fun.
Oh, that's cool. Now, you've got people walking up to your large livestock with horns. Do you have to carry some sort of liability insurance or something like that to go out to these events?
I do, yes. Yeah, we do carry liability insurance, just to protect them, the other people and ourselves, everybody involved, the facilitators of the events. They like to see that also. Yep.
Very interesting. Wow, that's a fascinating deal. Do your oxen, do they graze with the rest of your cattle, or you keep them all separate?
They will graze fine with with everything but the bull. They don't get along real well with the bull.
Okay.
And so I keep them separated from the bull.
Okay. Interesting stuff. All right. Now, you mentioned a book you're writing. Can you give us a teaser on that? What's that going to be about?
The top 3 mistakes new farmers make. And as we just look back, and, although I'm a fifth-generation farmer, in some regards we're a first-generation farmer also. And we just sat down and started thinking through the process. As a new farmer, we love seeing, Matt, the new farmers that are coming on the stage. And you and I'm sure you're familiar with the data, the statistics, how many farmers are going to be retiring in the coming years, and the need for farmers to step into those roles. And as we just look back and talk to our family, our grandparents, my parents, and we look at my wife and I and our family farms experiences, we just see there's 3 pretty major mistakes that we've made, that if other people can avoid, I think it can really help them. And so, it's the first attempt at a book. We do our blog writing, other things like that, and we find out we do enjoy education and writing, and so it'll be fun to get this launched. I hope to get it launched or get it out soon after the new year, and hopefully it can be a benefit to others to avoid some of the mistakes we've made, because I'll tell you, I shared this with other people, we have made our share of mistakes, and they've been costly mistakes. They really have. But if someone else can just benefit from some of them and avoid some of those costly mistakes, I hope it can be a benefit to them.
Well, that would be great. Well, Mark, you're a fascinating person. You've got a lot of really interesting things going on, and you have found a way to carve out a niche in ag. That is for sure.
Well, like I said, it's been the school of hard knocks, Matt. It really has been. My parents, my grandparents, my in-laws have been very supportive through the years. I think sometimes they advised on things that in my forwardness I went ahead with, and I found out later I wish I would have listened to their counsel. But in other things, they've just been supportive, and they've been able to see that we've been able to grow something, and it's been hard work, determination, perseverance, and just some common sense, I guess. Just do the best you can with what you got, and like I said, the costly mistakes we look back at, I laugh at myself over. Yeah. But I look at that and it's like, I wouldn't have known if I wouldn't have made those mistakes.
Right.
But if we can help someone else, and that's why another thing, anytime I get a phone call, I'll get phone calls occasionally from someone that's just getting new to farming, or recently I had someone call me that was seeing our name in the some publication about, and they wanted to start raising grass-fed beef, and they were interested in Devons. And, if I can just share something to help them to be, a couple steps forward of where we were at, that means a lot to us, just to bless them.
That's great. Well, Mark, if somebody out there listening, they want more information, they want to contact you for some reason, how should they go about doing that?
Go to our blog, The Farmer's Pitchfork, thefarmerspitchfork.com. We also can be found on Facebook on Double M Farms. We can be found there, Farm Food for You. Or call me. I'm not opposed to giving my phone number out. They can call me. It's on the blog. It's on our Facebook page.
Okay.
Give me a call. Be glad to help out whoever can.
Awesome. I'll put that all in the show notes for today, too, so all those links will be up there. Mark, this has been great. Way longer than I normally go, but I could keep going. I've still got another million questions for you. Thank you so much for coming on and doing this today.
Hey, you're welcome, Matt. It's been enjoyable.
Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. I know that was a long one, but man, I could have kept going. I really could have. That could have been a 2 or 3 hour episode, no question about it. What a great conversation. Thank you very much for being here, and as always, enjoy your journey to the ultimate lifestyle business, agriculture.